You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're talking about 1985's Re-Animator. Here we go.
All right, shall we reanimate ourselves?
Let's get into it. Yet another Charles Band produced movie that we're going to get into here. You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. Pete, with me today to talk about H.P. Lovecraft's Re-Animator with returning guest extraordinaire, Nick Diak. A little bit about Nick. He is a writer, pop culture scholar, convention speaker, fellow podcaster, along with his partner, Michelle Brittany, who's also been a guest on the Fan2Fan Podcast. They co-host the H.P. Lovecast podcast that's dedicated to the works inspired by Lovecraft.
15 cc's of reagent.
This is not an advertisement for a new movie. This is a warning. If you are squeamish, if you have nightmares, if you have a weak heart, before you experience Re-Animator, think very carefully. H.P. Lovecraft's classic tale of horror, Re-Animator. Remember, you've been warned.
He's dead? Not anymore.
We're talking about Re-Animator, directed by Stuart Gordon, produced by Brian Usna, that was produced by Charles Band. A movie that I'm very interested, Pete, to dig into this movie because you have said quite a few times how, as you were growing up, you seem to have a very delineation between your genres, whether it was comedy or horror. And I think this movie is very much a hybrid of different tones. So I'll be interested to hear what you think about Re-Animator, Pete.
Well, I will say that this covers like two recurring themes of some of the recent episodes that we've done. One that you just hit on it. Yes, this is that mixture of horror and comedy that, as I've talked about before, when I was a kid, I did not enjoy.
And you cited Evil Dead 2 as a movie that kind of was a good example of that.
Right. Yeah. I loved Evil Dead. The second one, I was like, what's with all this like Three Stooges comedy? And then when I got a little bit older, it's like, give me some more of that Three Stooges comedy. But I will say, and this is the second part of like the theme, is like this was another movie that for whatever reason had escaped my not awareness, because I was very aware of it, but I had never seen it before until literally I was able to wrap it up like about 30 minutes before we started recording today. So it was actually a first watch for me, which incredibly enough, given my history of seeing a lot of horror, a lot of movies across the gamut in the spectrum, including some very, very bad movies, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. I really liked it. Kind of wish that I had seen it sooner. I had seen clips before. Like I know some of the more infamous parts, which we'll probably get into. It's kind of plays it straight until about the last 30 minutes where it really gets bonkers. And I enjoyed the hell out of it. It was a lot of fun.
I love Re-Animator. As a Lovecraft scholar, as a co-host on a Lovecraft podcast, you have to take Re-Animator in all its forms. And I can't tell you the first time I saw Re-Animator. It's probably 90s, around the same time discovering like Army of Darkness. And it is a movie I've seen countless times and enjoy it each time. And I always find something new in this film to appreciate because it is so, especially toward the end, chaotic for I want to say kind of a procedural film because it's very science, I'm putting that in air quotes, based where it's very mythological. And Stuart Gordon is a type of director that has a very mythological way of filming things, from his Full Moon stuff to even movies like Fortress and whatnot. But I love Re-Animator. I know, to me, it's a ground zero for H.P. Lovecraft, especially cinema. Even though before Re-Animator, AIP was putting out Lovecraft movies like Die Monster Die, The Haunted Palace, Dunwich Horror. But, those were, a generation or two before Re-Animator. So let's just be honest, the crowd that discovered Re-Animator, the AIP films, those are my folks' movies. I don't watch those. We have Re-Animator. It's bloody. We could watch it on VHS. It's right at the home boom market. It was just the right time with the right components to make a faithful. I think we're going to talk about how faithful it is. I don't think it's it's irrelevant if it's faithful or not. Lovecraft film that to me it's the ground zero. It is the barometer. It is the measuring stick. It is as alien as to space horror. Re-Animator is to Lovecraftian horror. And Jeffrey Combs steals every shot he's in.
I'll be very interested to hear from you, Nick, as someone who obviously would know, being the co-host of a Lovecraft podcast. When you mentioned some of these are inspired, how much, deference they have in actually, grabbing from the source material or running away with it and making their own type of movie. Because this movie, like you said, very much a product of the 80s, of the burgeoning home video market, of its producer, Charles Band, who, again, is doing more research into him and seeing how, the connections, the web kind of weaves together. You have Stuart Gordon, who's from Chicago, my hometown, and it looks like his history is in as a playwright in directing and producing plays. And I don't know if that's what you mean, Nick, when you were talking about his tone or his style of filmmaking.
It's just a lot of the films he does, I think, are very, how do I put it? I wouldn't call him an auteur per se, but there is a very precise style to his filmmaking, especially like when he did I think it was Robot Jocks. It treats the most fantastic material as legit, because most of his movies are really out there, from Dolls, Robot Jocks, the Edgar Allan Poe Pit and the Pendulum. He turns that into a crazy Inquisition horror film, but he's able to grind it in such a fashion that you believe all of it. In a prior podcast, for example, we were talking about the Parasite, a precursor to Re-Animator when it comes to Charles Band stuff, where we're talking about it takes place in a dystopian post-apocalyptic future, but does it really matter? It's just all kind of window dressing that doesn't service the story. You can deal without it. It doesn't really add anything. Like, if that movie had been in Stuart Gordon's hands, all that stuff to me would be grounded and in service of everything. And you would buy into the setting. You would buy into, this really is a fantastic world, that here's the rules that make it work. And I don't have any questions about it. It's all here. It makes sense. I'm not left with any gaps, or why does this work when it shouldn't work? Why are characters behaving this way? I guess that's what I'm trying to say, is he's not an auteur, because I think he's too multi-genre, but every one of his genres he works in is very fantastic, and he grounds it that you really do buy into it.
I'd say even like his mainstream stuff, like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, like you're dealing with that what you're talking about there, Nick. Like, he's dealing with these very fantastical scenarios or fantastical worlds. That seems to be the one through line for him.
Even the newest Jurassic Park films can't do what Stuart Gordon does in establishing here's a world with rules that works, even though we've got giant dinosaurs and crazy cloning and all that stuff. It still feels fake or far off or detached, where the first Jurassic Park doesn't have that. You are engaged. You buy into it. You buy into Stuart Gordon films. You can buy into, as ludicrous of a plot of Re-Animator is, that there's a reagent that can bring people back from the dead. He sells it. Not just Stuart Gordon, but, Jeffrey Combs and the characters in it. They all work to sell this movie. The end product speaks for itself. It's fantastic.
I also think it helps the fact that they have Jeffrey Combs, who seems to be in on the tone that Gordon is trying to convey, because he really kind of sells that groundedness that I think you're talking about, Nick, where this is almost like a cartoon of a movie, especially towards the last 20 some minutes, because it gets so chaotic, but so ridiculous. But it's really the first, beginning of the movie. And maybe, again, it's Gordon's directorial style that you're talking about. But a lot of it seems to me at least grounded, because Jeffrey Combs is I'm kind of taking this seriously. This character is serious. He is legitimately a zealot about believing that this fluid can reanimate corpses. He believes in the science. And this may get a little Three Stooges-y at times, and this may get a little nuts, but at least in having someone in Jeffrey Combs be no, as an actor, I'm going to play it this way, and people are going to have to respond to the serious tone that I think I can reanimate deceased bodies. Then, like you said, you can kind of layer all this pseudoscience on top, because you're well, it seems like this is kind of being treated somewhat seriously, at least a little bit.
Yeah. I'm going to play off what Pete was talking about earlier, Evil Dead 2, and I'll bring a little bit Army of Darkness, because you have that tone of horror comedy, which would be the burgeoning, realm of splatstick. This is splatstick film. If you listen to some of the commentaries,
I just have to interrupt. Is that term trademarked? Because if you don't, that's really good. You should. Splatstick is really good.
No, splatstick's the total real term. I don't know who oh man, I wish I was that smart. No, that's been a term that's been around for a while. It definitely is used to describe movies like Dead Alive, Evil Dead 2.
Every Sam Raimi movie.
If you listen to some of the commentaries for Army of Darkness, because there's a couple different cuts of Army of Darkness. There's theatrical cut and a director's cut and whatnot, and it mostly comes down toward the ending battle of what they cut out and everything. But it changes the character of Ash quite a bit. Depending on how you embrace Army of Darkness, Ash's character is in the theatrical cut. He's more heroic. He's there to, at the end of the day, he's there to save the day. But in a director's cut, both Raimi and Campbell prefer a different version of Ash where he's a bit more cowardly, that he runs and he hides and before he gets into his car to chop off deadites and everything. They prefer more, I don't want to say reserved, but not as heroic, loudmouth version of Ash. And I bring that up because that changes kind of a tone of how do you sell a movie. If you watch Army of Darkness, depending on how you watch it, either you have a loudmouth braggart who's this brazenly going through the film, or you kind of have a more cowardly, selfish type characters going through the film. And depending on how you do that situates how your movie goes, especially the climax of Army of Darkness when the big deadite battle's going on. Is he a hero? Is he a coward? Is he a braggart, or is he more selfish? I bring that up because Re-Animator can almost go that way as well, depending on how Jeffrey Combs, because he is the pivotal character in this, even though he's not the hero, he's not Dr. Kane or anything. Depending on how Combs takes that character, you're going to wind up on that seesawing that Army of Darkness, I don't want to say suffers from. I love Army of Darkness. It's one of my favorites, but it changes the tone of the film. And I think what Bruce and Sam Raimi couldn't do in some of the different cuts of Army of Darkness, Gordon and Combs are able to do in Re-Animator and sell it with a consistent tone, despite the chaoticness of undead bodies exploding everywhere, because guess what? That's what happens in Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness. It's just delivered in a solid fashion.
One of the things that I noted in Jeffrey Combs' performance that I think is really a testament to his skill as an actor is that he could very easily have taken this into scenery chewing to the nth degree. And he kind of comes up to he gets up to the line a few times, but he never really crosses it. And like his character from the get-go, whether it's his inflection, whether it's his delivery of the lines, like there's something weird about him, and you definitely pick up on that. But he dials it back just enough that it doesn't spill over into parody. It doesn't spill over into that like blatant scenery chewing. And I think that having not really acted in films before, I don't have that to draw on from personal experience, but from having seen enough acting performances, I think that takes, a certain amount of skill to pull off what he did in this role, to make it like that engaging and just getting you right up to that edge of almost going too far, but not going that extra step.
I think the testament to Combs in this film is that he is basically the canonical Herbert West. If you read the original story or stories by Lovecraft, because it was originally serialized, the Dr. West in that one is a bit different. He doesn't look like Jeffrey Combs does. I mean, he's blonde hair, blue eyes in the original story. He's a lot more insane. In fact, he becomes a doctor during World War I. He's in the trenches, and he's just reanimating crap left and right just because he can. He's definitely more, insane. He's lost his focus of where he wants to actually develop this reagent for possible altruistic purposes, but then definitely goes downhill. There is that hint of altruism in Herbert West, despite how misguided he is. But regardless, the portrayal of West is different enough from the source material that it's its own thing, but in successor texts, comics, other Re-Animator stories, whatever, it's all based off Combs' version. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if someone out there just actually, they have. There is a Dynamite Comics where they basically redid the Re-Animator story with a crossover of Army of Darkness, where Bruce Campbell's character is like the assistant to Dr. West, but that Dr. West, for all purposes, is depicted like Jeffrey Combs. And so he is, I think the movie version at least especially the depiction of Herbert West, is the canonical one. It has superseded the literary one. Even if the rest of the story is, again, I'm going to say quote unquote faithful, are not faithful, because it draws very much from the original material, right, wrong, or indifferent, because there are Lovecraft purists and they will never be satisfied with any adaptation. This Herbert West is the Herbert West. That's his character, and that's Combs.
So I want to come back to you so we can talk more about obviously, since you will know more about the text that it originated from. But Pete, since you literally are like an hour fresh, what did you think of Re-Animator now that you're like an hour removed from having seen it?
No, I was digging like a lot of the influences that I was picking up. Like the one that jumped out at me early on, there is a lot of similarities to like the Hammer Frankenstein movies, where Dr. Herbert West is like kind of, he's operating in Switzerland and things don't go so well, so he's going to relocate to America. It was very much like that. Peter Cushing's Dr. Frankenstein through that run of films where, he's not the hero and oftentimes he's the flat out villain of those movies. And he's so blinded by his like devotion and his belief that what he's doing is right, that he just causes mayhem wherever he goes. And there was a lot to that. And I was really digging that. I was not expecting that. I like I said, like there are scenes and there are parts of this movie that I was aware of and I kind of knew about, but so much of it was like very new to me that the character of Dr. Kane, like I did not understand that. Like Nick had mentioned when we were talking about Parasite, about how he likes those callbacks that kind of, those thematic callbacks that button up a movie. And you get that here from like his opening scene of trying to, revive a woman on the table to at the end trying to revive Meg, that there's like that, that echo of, where he failed at the begining. Will he succeed this time? And
in this case, it probably works a little better than Parasite, really. Though. Let's admit that.
Yeah, I'd put this like a notch above Parasite,
Just a notch?
No,
so I do have that. Since Pete, you said, shades of other movies in here. Both of you as hardcore MST3K fans, there should be a movie from MST3K's canon that should come out in spades in this film. Bring that Wouldn't Die?
Oh, I can see that. I can see that. Absolutely. Yeah. Going around, killing the women, bringing them back. I can see that.
Yeah. The severed head, I keep thinking of Mary Jo Pehl as Jan, the head in the pan or whatever. That's Dr. Gale right there.
That makes sense. No, well, I think maybe especially the difference being that atomic age monster, mad scientist fare, going back to Jeffrey Combs and how they portrayed him. I didn't have maybe that same feeling that you did, Pete, about like the slash stick.
Splat stick.
Oh, now slash stick might be pretty good too. That kind of like hybrid of genres. But I remember watching movies like Dead Alive and Return of the Living Dead. And I was like, Night of the Living Dead stalwart. Like, I love the Romero movie. It was like one of the first black and white movies that kind of took me out of that very, I don't want to say naive, because I don't want to be too hard on my young self. But like, you kind of grow up, and especially growing up in the 80s, there was so much stuff that you're like, I don't want to watch a black and white movie. Like, those are old. Those are my dad's or my grandpa's movies. I don't want to watch them. And Night of the Living Dead was the first black and white movie I saw that taught me that I was wrong. That there were like good black and white movies out there that I should give a chance. And then when I saw something like Return of the Living Dead, it's like, well, what have you done to my boy, my sweet boy? Like, how could you guys be so ridiculous and take zombies to such a like cartoony, Three Stooges-y type level? But then it grew on me, because then I realized this is a different kind of thing with actually kind of like a bit of a respect to what Romero zombies did, that became so iconic. So like Re-Animator was always in that place for me where I'm like, yeah, it kind of takes it serious, and then it goes total Looney Tunes. But what you were saying earlier, Nick, it's Combs' depiction of a mad scientist who's not mad, because everything about him, he's not antisocial.
He's a little antisocial.
Yeah, a little antisocial, but like in a way where he does respond in like not really full creepy fashion to like an ad for Roommate. And obviously, Roommate must love cats doesn't work out very well for the poor cat. But, he's having some slightly creepy vibes, but not so much that, he's being dramatic or theatrical. It's like, yeah, this guy wants the basement and all of a sudden he pulls out a wad of cash to pay off the first month's rent. But he's not super weird that Meg is going to Kane, to her boyfriend, and saying, yeah, maybe we shouldn't do this. Like, this is a little, like, this guy's a little out there, but it works.
All of his like quips, after an experiment, that's what helps seals it. They're both funny, but they're both truthful. Like, what if he had a fresh specimen? What if he had the dose correct at that time or whatever? Every time something blows up, he'll say something like, the body wasn't fresh enough, or I gave him too much, or he's reacting violently. But he's acting very mad scientist.
But doesn't it also sound, Nick, it's like kind of like A/B testing, putting out a theory, seeing if it works, and then it's not working. I mean, we know he hates pencils. That's like one thing for sure that, he despises. But beyond that, he's kind of just going through the scientific method. It just happens to be less with a volcano for the science fair and more with like dead bodies, right?
I will say though, his first instinct when he's getting blackmailed though is to decapitate a doctor's head with a shovel. So there is, for all his focus, there are some outlying behaviors going on with Dr. West.
Did you catch the doctor's name that he decapitated?
Dr. Hill?
Oh no, I'm sorry. You know what? I'm thinking of the German scientist in the beginning whose name is Hans Gruber. Sorry.
Die Hard.
Oh, I missed that.
Hans Grubers do not fare very well in cinema.
Where is detonators?
But sorry, Nick, you were going to say.
No, even though he just decapitates Dr. Hill's head, his second option or his thought is, I got to bring him back to life, which is, I broke the vase. I will replace it. I will fix it. It's a responsible thing to do. And he's a responsible scientist.
And he ends up getting a 2-for-1 out of it. So, I mean, yes. I guess,
And before, even without ever really fully explained, unless I miss it, in decapitating Hill, he now has like a zombie reanimated body that needs to have the ability to control other zombie reanimated bodies. So I don't know if Hill happens to have like some sort of zombie reanimated Wi-Fi that's unique to him, but given a few sequels, and I have not seen the sequels, so I don't know if that's ever explored.
I believe what it was originally intended was Dr. Hill did have some sort of psychic or mind control like element to him that they completely wrote out or anything, but residuals of that are in the movie with his, using the laser to like go into your frontal cortex so he can kind of control you. But I believe that was the original thought was he had some sort of mind control ability. So yeah, it is kind of, silly at the end where all the zombies attack at his command and everything. It's kind of written off with his laser cranial thing. But as a side note, that is in the movie, in the book, not the mind control aspect, but when the doctor gets his head decapitated, that's in the World War I scene in the book. It's not his rival doctor or anything. I think it's some sort of other soldier, but yeah, a guy gets his head totally decapitated and Herbert West says, I will reanimate both of them, and a whole bunch of other stuff as well. And the end of the story is that's what comes, wearing a prosthetic head and everything, comes and gets Dr. West. It totally happens in the original story.
So, Nick, let's get into the original text first, because it obviously doesn't take place in, I'm Stuart Gordon was from Chicago. I think when he originally wrote this, I was reading, he was writing it as a TV show, and it did not pan out that way. I guess at one point, and this is where like worlds collide, a friend of his knew John Carpenter, and John Carpenter kind of put it out there and said that there was very little interest in like horror TV. So he kind of fashioned this 13-episode series that they had kind of planned out into this, 80, 90 something minute movie. And then while they're doing the movie, Brian Usna was working with Charles Band to use like post-production services. And Charles Band saw dailies and was like, whoa, this looks really good. And good idea on not making this a kind of like period piece, but rather setting it in the present day. So then Charles Band ends up producing it and they release it. But the original book, nothing to do with, I don't know where Miskatonic University would be. I don't think it's in Chicago, but in somewhere on the East Coast, right? So
original story does take place in Miskatonic. Miskatonic is Lovecraft's like invented catch-all university, known for its occult department because it has a copy of the Necronomicon. Miskatonic is in Arkham. Arkham is in Rhode Island, and that's depending on your nomenclature, you could call Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos. You could call it his Arkham mythos as well, if you want to, because he has a lot of connected stories. That was his sandbox. So characters from Call of Cthulhu are some characters in Re-Animator, for instance. They all go to the same college. They're all frat buddies. But no, Miskatonic, it's sometimes placed in other places. Like example, let me sidetrack here. Like the AIP film Die Monster Die, which is basically a remake of Lovecraft's Color Out of Space. It takes place in England, but it takes place in Arkham, England. Well, Arkham's in Rhode Island, but it's just, you can put it wherever you really want to. So anyway, original story does take place at Miskatonic. Dr. West is a medical student there, and the narrator is also a student there, and they do become buddies. Initially, it is that the narrator is enthralled at the reagent. He wants to help people. Through the course of the stories, as Herbert West becomes more and more crazy, the narrator, which is Dr. Keene in the movie, mostly sticks with him out of fear because he has seen some shit. They are constant. I mean, he's more of an accomplice in the book version than in the movie version. They are overtly going out together and digging graves and unearthing people like ghouls in the night and reanimating them and, purposely killing people. And actually, it's more Herbert West that kills people. He still lies. Like in the movie, Herbert West is a chronic liar. Oh yeah, I totally didn't kill that cat. But the narrator sticks with him through and through, doing the same ghoulish activities. The funny thing, though, is he gets off pretty unscathed in the story. Herbert West ends the same way, killed by a horde of zombies, because the story takes place over decades, while the movie takes place over maybe a week. Over a decade of reanimating corpses, you kind of leave I don't want to call it a paper trail, but I want to call it a body trail, but let's call it a body trail of reanimated bodies in your wake that someday they're all going to catch up to you. And that's exactly what happens at the end of Herbert West Re-Animator. The story is they all congregate on Dr. West and rip him to shreds. So anyway, the story takes place in the 1910s and 20s because it was World War I times, and that's also when Lovecraft was alive, and that's when he kind of set everything. The things that the movie gets verbatim from the story is, one, the kind of relationship between West and the main character, although, again, like I said earlier, it's a bit more accomplice-y versus the movie where it's more Dr. King really wants to help people and he sees this as a way to help people. The disembodied head for Dr. Hill, there is no Dr. Hill in the original story, but the same fate happens. The guy gets his head chopped off in both parts reanimated. However, there is a Dr. Halsey in the story, and it's the exact same character. There's no love interest. There's no Barbara Crampton or anything, but the dean of Miskatonic Medical School does get reanimated. He goes on a violent rampage and kills a lot of people, and he is eventually subdued and put inside of like a mental institution to be studied. So his arc is verbatim recreated in the movie, except he has a daughter in the film. So that's lifted pretty straight up. The ending is exactly the same. Some people may not agree with this. I'm going to go out and say it, but the original Lovecraft story is very funny. Even though Lovecraft is known for his cosmic horror of, I can't comprehend this titanic, invisible alien deity and I shall go mad. Re-Animator, the original, it's almost a parody. It really is a send-up of the gothic horror / mad scientist horror that was coming out the prior century, the kind of Victorian style of both progress in medicine / post Frankenstein. It's funny because it was very ludicrous. The same kind of gags in this of reanimated bodies going crazy and sneaking out at night to dig up corpses. It's not like serious, like at the beginning of like Universal's Frankenstein, where they're being very serious by it. It's comical in the original story. And I think that's what makes the movie very successful, is it sees that little bit of dark comedy in Lovecraft's writing. And Lovecraft was not a comedic writer, not my long shot. This might have just been happenstance, or this was a paid gig, by the way. In fact, side note, the original story was serialized, and I think it's in 5 parts or whatnot, one for each issue it appeared in, and it's very repetitive. Could have used a lot of editing. but because it was a paid gig, I think that's why it's turned up a little bit on the comedy and the more accessibleness, I would say, for the audience at the time, our readers at the time. So anyway, to me, the Stuart Gordon movie finds those absurd, elements like, if we put that in a movie, that would be hilarious.
Nick, do you know, did Lovecraft serve in World War I? I'm not, I mean, no. I know, okay. I didn't know if he took like some personal experiences because, the gore in this movie, I think is really well done. But I'm just tying that into like World War I, having seen some shit in the trenches, if he was pulling that from like real life experiences.
No, I don't think. No, Lovecraft was a very sickly man who kind of stayed to himself. He made attempt to be enlisted, but he did not make it. He was very. He didn't go anywhere. He basically stayed in New England, be it Providence. I mean, he moved to New York like for a brief spell and hated it, partly because there was not white people there and he was a very racist guy and they, I don't want to hang out in this town. So yeah, he was a homebody. He stayed basically in the same area forever. Drawing from World War I, you would have had readers back then that would have read that and had a little bit of, I saw some shit and now I get to read about it. So it brings a little bit of that topicality. But about the gore in this film, I think this is one of the reasons why I really like Re-Animator is even though it's very gory, it's very detailed gory. We brought up Dead Alive earlier, and I am probably in the minority here. I am not the biggest fan of Dead Alive. It's okay. I prefer Bad Taste when it comes to early Peter Jackson splatstick, but there's that scene where, he straps the lawnmower to his chest and he's running down zombies that you have to juggle comedy horror just right or it becomes wrong. Too much horror, too much gore, too much whatever. And to me, it's that one scene in Dead Alive is just a little too cartoony and a little too much blood. This is a guy who, loves Evil Dead too. But it's just excessive and it's kind of boring. But you bring in like Re-Animator. There's like the scene where Dr. Hill is demonstrating to the class how to cut open a patient's skull to look at his brain. And he's talking through it. And again, this is coming back to what I was saying earlier. Stuart Gordon is very, I think, methodological. He really sells what's going on here. And I think having this very classroom scene of this is what you do. You put an incision here. You bring the scalp here. You put the bone saw here. And it's very Stanley Kubrick. If you ever watched Dr. Strangelove when they're going through how to actually drop the bomb, put these buttons here, set the receiver here and all that stuff, it's at that level. But, he pops open the skull, he takes out the brain, you could see the cavity. It's so detailed. You could see where the brainstem would have been, the hole that goes down to the spine and everything. Whereas I think in a movie like Dead Alive, it would have just been a big bloody gooey mess, things squirting everywhere. And like, it's kind of funny. Where again, he's treating it seriously. And because it's so detailed and so matter-of-factly that it grounds it and it makes it darkly funny, I think. And it makes the gore in the film seem more justified. It's not Three Stooges-y. It's not over the top or very comic. It actually has a rhyme or reason, and there it is.
Yeah, you don't get the fire hose of red liquid blood coming out of the cellar like Evil Dead 2. That is hysterical, but yeah, it's a very different take on using gore and blood in this one.
And I appreciate that. That's the hard balance of horror and comedy, I think. And I think Re-Animator just does it very well granted, at the end, you have naked corpses with guts hanging out and they're flailing and dancing and everything. And it's just like, okay, that's way over the top. But I buy it because of how it's been treated up to that point. From the smushed cat. I mean, you have the reanimated cat that they bludgeon to death and they reanimate again. But, there's that scene where Herbert West, he's like, we can agree it's dead. He just picks it up and drops it. It just slams back down. It's so cold, but morbidly funny. But it's that kind of, treatment or vision or whatever on how to handle gore and, what would normally be an unsightly visual in a film.
That was one of my favorite scenes in watching the movie, was when they're in the basement trying to corral the reanimated cat, because there's a couple of things going on there. One, and we talked about this on our episode where we discussed Salem's Lot, the miniseries, you've got like the swinging light that is like casting shadows, and they're moving in and out of the shadows. So you've got like this great lighting shadow work that is kind of disorienting, and you're trying to figure out what's going on. But at the same time, and I know I mentioned like they played it mostly straight until towards the end, but this scene is not played completely straight, but it's incredibly funny of them just like whacking various parts of the basement to try and like get the cat to come out or to hit it. I was like, I'm like, oh, okay. I'm like, I see what they're doing here. Like, this is just really well done. I have to imagine I would have loved to have been Jeffrey Combs or Bruce Abbott in that scene, because I feel like they had to have a blast just going around just whacking random shit in the basement.
I watch movies with subtitles on just because I don't want to miss anything. The subtitles in that scene are hilarious because when the cat is meowing, it actually says dynamic meowing.
Also sounds like a full moon movie. That one scene, though, I wanted to mention that they play it straight in trying to get that cat, Pete, like you were saying, but you never actually see the cat. It feels very theatrical, and I think this is where maybe it's Stuart Gordon, his theater background, working with theater actors. It looks like some of these actors, including the actor who played Hill, they're all kind of talking to the cheap seats. It's like a little bit over the top. So that scene, like you could almost see a bunch of actors in a basement, and there's no cat. It's not like they're actually working with a trained cat that's going to react to them. They're putting no one in danger, but trying to sell to us that there is this demonic cat meowing and running around. The other part about that's an interesting connection, so I'm going to roll with that one, is the intro music. Between that scene with the light and the intro music, I swear to God, it's just the intro from Bernard Herrmann in Psycho. Yeah. Like it's very like dun 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 dun, dun versus dun 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 dun. Okay, how Stuart Gordon, Charles Band, whatever, were not sued for that, I don't understand.
It's the Vanilla Ice version of the Psycho
yes,
theme.
but it makes for good music.
Scenes under pressure? No,
yes.
I changed one note.
Yes, great scene, great music, but yeah, I think the fact that you have these actors, and I was reading a lot about them. It seems like they were part of Stuart Gordon. He was a part of organic theater in Chicago, and he was using actors that were a part of that, which, again, I just imagine folks that are used to working with very little props, kind of willing to improvise and just go full bore.
The Richard Band music is fantastic in this film, especially considering I believe he was inspired by Psycho. And I've always thought Richard Band, when he's on his A game, he's able to replicate other sounds very well. Y'all, I think, Bernie, you've brought up your appreciation to Zone Troopers a couple times. There's music cues in Zone Troopers that sound both 1940s big band, but also flat out Star Wars. That soundtrack is a total original episode 4 type of stuff. But the opening credits to the film with the Psycho style music going on, and it's got those very colorful medical drawings and everything, makes me think of the old Roger Corman AIP films, because a lot of his had those kind of very psychedelic, very colorful openings. In fact, even the Dean Stockwell Dunwich Horror has it's very blue and very morphic with like gods and deities and stuff coming out, but it has this really cool score over, color over black. Yeah, a lot of the Corman AIP stuff had very similar openings that had a very cool use of sound on color. And I think Re-Animator, coincidentally, maybe are lifting directly, who knows, that the generation prior of Lovecraft films.
Certainly a movie that, like, the music punches above its weight class, and it just reminds me when the three of us were talking about Deathstalker 2 and some of those movies that did have, like, I think it was Battle Beyond the Stars and Wizards of the Lost Kingdom 1 or 2 that had James Horner. And that's the thing with Band in some of for the music cues in this. You're like, whoa, this is really good. And I think because of that, the cool graphics for the intro and the very much like Psycho-inspired music like really worked for it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And the music cues and the themes, to me, had a very like circus, like carnival feel to them, which I thought like was like a perfect fit for the type of movie that you're in for. So I really enjoyed that. And then just, again, as a designer, going back to the opening credits, even the titles, I loved what they did with the titles. It's a kind of a Gothic serif font, but the way that they had the push kind of going in and going out, again, when you have those overlays of like the medical graphics, I'm sure that I'm misremembering some films that might have done it differently, but for its time, even, mid 80s, that was not, it was a lot easier to just put like opening titles up there and just kind of just do fade in, fade out. Like they were being more creative with their titles, which I very much appreciated.
And I think the other part to that too, Pete, the titles were always kind of memorable to me. And, as like designers, we think of Saul Bass as kind of like the beyond end all, like succinct, effective design. The one thing about this that works well for the age that it was made in the 80s, but also that's probably helped it in its legacy. The credits are very colorful. And I think it goes back to how you were talking about Hammer films and how I guess this was a little bit inspired by Revenge of Frankenstein that was directed by Terrence Fisher that had Cushing in there. But that's the one thing I remember about watching Hammer films. We all grew up watching reruns of Bride of Frankenstein and, The Creature from the Black Lagoon. You remember those as cool monster black and white flicks you remember watching as a kid. But then I remember when I saw Hammer films, I'm like, whoa, here's Frankenstein in Technicolor with bright red blood. Kind of neat that this is a product of its time, which only goes perfectly with the Mountain Dew looking agent that they use to reanimate everything. If the intro was in black and white, it wouldn't work as well. When you see it now, you're like, yeah, it's got to be a little loud, a little very colorful.
Remember, you can find the Fan2Fan Podcast at www.fanpodcast.com. Facebook, just search Fan2Fan Podcast. That's FAN, the number 2, FAN.
On Instagram at Fan2Fan Podcast.
Or on Twitter at Fan2Fan Podcast.
We'd love to hear from you, so send a message and let us know what you think of the show. Thanks.
And now, on with the show.
Earlier, I had mentioned every time I watch Re-Animator, because it's so chaotic, I detect something new in it. And this apparently is a long-standing joke in Re-Animator, and I only noticed it on this last viewing, but the opening scene where they introduce after they introduce Barbara Crampton and she's getting it on with Dr. Keene and they show that Talking Heads poster. I never picked up on that joke before, but I'm like, is that a Talking Heads poster? I bet that is foreshadowing for Dr. Hill's character. But regardless, that's a Talking Heads Stop Making Sense poster, and even if that wasn't foreshadowing, that is awesome.
Oh, yeah, totally. And I think I read where Bruce Abbott, who was in the sex scene with Barbara Crampton, was like, I didn't even, I was busy doing other things. So he had like no recollection of the poster being on the wall. Which, I don't think you can blame him.
It's kind of neat that, especially over the last, 30 or some episodes, Pete, you've discovered Assault on Precinct 13. Thanks to folks like Josh and Scott who kept pushing Tremors into like our viewpoint, got it out of our blind spot. We got to watch it. It's like, oh, this is a really cool movie. So it's kind of neat that now, you've been able to watch Re-Animator, seemingly enjoy it. And then we get to chat about it with someone who actually hosts a podcast that talks about Lovecraft, that gives us a little bit of context about the original. Obviously, Nick, you're a fan of this movie.
I am. I like the film. I like the original story, and I like the derivative universe that helped launched. It's funny to see. It's just one movie. It's just not even Lovecraft's best story, but like the character of Dr. West has kind of become a life of its own. That he's almost an anti-hero now. Like in the comics, like he actually fights crime with zombies, helps save the day and stuff like that. I don't know. He's just such an iconic villain that even, I don't know, what has it been 30 years since Re-Animator's come out, that I'm actually surprised that he's not higher up on the list of like iconic monster villains, like a Dr. Frankenstein or a Fu Manchu or something along those lines. That I think should be part of that greater pillar of iconic mad scientist type characters. And I know that Jeffrey Combs has kind of revisited the role before. I had a movie, I actually got rid of it because it was so bad, but he did a made-for-sci-fi channel movie called Hammerhead, which is basically Re-Animator, but with hammerhead sharks. But he basically plays Dr. West in that film as well. And it wasn't that good, but I think it just shows kind of the one enduringness of that character, that he is Dr. West. That or, he's a Star Trek character. Those are the two things that, Jeffrey Combs does the most.
All right, so I'm going to guess, though, Pete, since you just saw Re-Animator, you haven't seen the sequel or sequels from this?
No, I have not, but it's it's odd because my cousin and I we did rent From Beyond back in the day, and I really like that one too. It gets very bonkers, but again, that was my introduction to Jeffrey Combs and Barbara Crampton in that film, and I always liked it because Ken Foree from Dawn of the Dead is in it. So I was just like, fuck yeah! I'm like, we the world needs more Ken Foree in anything. So. That was my touch point, and for whatever reason, I did not make the jump to Re-Animator until last night.
It's kind of neat when you watch a movie like this, and you're like, "Oh yeah, like I remember, I really dug this movie." I haven't watched it as many times as Evil Dead 2 or Army of Darkness, but whatever Stuart Gordon, Combs, band, all those folks were doing, Crampton, they did a good job.
It's an important film. I think for Lovecraft media, it's important. To me, again, it's the measuring stick for anything that comes after. Even if it wasn't a Lovecraft film by itself, it's just a great 80s horror comedy. I love it. And plus the title, come on, Re-Animator. I mean, that is the title.
Ladies and gentlemen, Nick Diak, his words, Re-Animator 1985, an important film.